Okay, hey everybody. So we're in chapter 3 this week. How was this chapter for you guys?
For me, it's easier to get through because I've made a point of ignoring my irritation with language and just focusing on how much I like the points he's making.
Okay.
I also talked with Paul, and Paul said, if you'd actually met him, he would not be elitist at all about his languaging. It's just how he talks and so forth. He would make you feel warm and comfortable like you're an equal. So that.
So everyone else knows Paul Spencer is a Eugene resident who was a friend of Murray's, and they were in the Anarchist Federation together, and meeting regularly and exploring many of the concepts that are in this book. And he's a friend of Ken's. How about you, Mario? How was it for you?
Well, I had a brief encounter with the chapter because I had a busy week and I couldn't dedicate a lot of time. So I just went through very fast, and but I think I got the essence, I think. But we'll see.
Okay, great. And Sophia, anything you want to say?
I enjoyed it. I actually found this week more difficult than last week's chapter in terms of density of discussion, or just maybe very long-winded, many factored sentences. But I really enjoyed it. I really liked the discussion of scarcity in the first part. I think we'll go deeper into that, but that's definitely something that I'm interested in as someone who is exploring alternative economics and specifically post-scarcity economics. So that was really interesting. And then the second half of the chapter of just the different just transitions to different kinds of power relations, I thought was really interesting. It was especially interesting to be reading the part about implicit power in shamanistic cultures, sitting next to a native man who's very familiar with those power structures. I was reading it out loud, so that was interesting experience. So yeah, I'm excited to dig deeper into this chapter.
Great. Yeah, in some ways it was easier, but then I got really, as we started to, there's Lenore. Shoot, hold on one sec. Hi, we're on the air here. Go check your email. Check your email. I sent you the link. Okay, we'll see you soon. Quite early on, where he's referring to economic theory, and there's quite a bit of terminology like use value. I was like, okay, I gotta dig deeper into this. So I got stuck down a rabbit hole. So I'll share a little bit of that with you as much as it's pertinent to anybody and everybody. So I thought I'd start, I'm gonna just share a passage that I found interesting. I'm going to share my screen with you to get started. And this was on here we go, on page 131. Can you all see that, the text there?
Yep.
Okay, so hierarchy established itself not only subjectively in the real workaday world, but also subjectively in the individual unconscious, percolating into virtually every realm of experience. It has assimilated the syntax of everyday discourse, the very relationship between subject and object, humanity and nature. Difference was recast from its traditional status as unity and diversity into a linear system of separate, increasingly antagonistic powers, a system validated by all the resources of religion, morality, and philosophy. So I was really interested in this, and thought it might be a good jumping off point to explore where we see, before we start talking about economic systems, religion, science, and government, where do we experience hierarchy in our own thinking, in our language, or where do we see it represented in our world, coming back towards us, being reflected towards us? Does this resonate with anybody? Are there thoughts that you might have about that?
All over the place, everywhere.
I could share a little bit about the ways that I feel hierarchy within myself, specifically in the ways that my conceptual mind tries to take power over my entire experience rather than letting the different forms of engaging with the world, like emotion and intuition and embodied physical experience, be equals in that.
You haven't thought about why the mind seems to take a dominant role with regard to all the different sensory apparatus that we have?
Well, the mind integrates everything and tries to try to allow us to survive.
Mm-hmm. Is it something about the way the brain developed, or is it, I mean, I think for sure that our culture reinforces the cognitive experience and in a pretty commonly.
Well, we're taught that human beings are the crown of creation, and that the neurological crown of our creation is our neocortex, and that from our neocortex comes that rational type of thought. I think it's a confusion, however, the way this hierarchy of experience that puts the rationale above intuition and other things, you know, like Sophia was hinting at, that I think it's our culture that makes me think that my rational part is above any other part of experience, and not necessarily in connection with reality at all. I think it's a cultural myth that. Could you put the faces back in, because I just see the quote still?
I haven't removed them. I see them on my screen.
Okay.
But I can stop sharing if everybody's done with that.
I have one more thread about this, which which may open up a lot of things that where you can decide if we don't want to go there or not. I study a spiritual psychological synthesis called soul work, and in soul work, the inner critic part is called two different parts: the mental judge and the astral judge self. And they often assume the place of a high self and pretend at wisdom out of fear that they're not actually that the high self isn't actually there. So that's what I notice in this hierarchy, is that what we might call our rational intellectual self being placed by us, by our culture, at the height of our hierarchy, is that kind of a misplacement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I hear that term higher self a lot too, which has a hierarchy in it as well.
It's
So it's kind of interesting. You know, spiritual, religious, and spiritual traditions often will place the spirit as the highest self, or something that's like up here rather than in the body, right? Like the body from a lot of the traditional, like the major religions, let's say the Judeo-Christian and Islamic, which the three go together really. They're all based in the same kind of cortex, if you will, or matrix or core, are focused on that the body is less than.
And the brain is the paramount. And it contradicts a lot of the even scientific evidence that we haven't integrated very much culturally, that the heart is the more powerful electromagnetic transmitter than the brain by a long way, and that more messages neurologically go from the heart to the brain than brain to the heart. So we haven't integrated that at all.
So rather than getting into all the which is better, which and so on, I would say that each system has its hierarchy, right? So in the quantum realm, it might be more heart-centered or cellular, energetic-centered even. There are solar religions that say the sun is the god, or religions that say the moon is God, or the Buddha is the closest thing to God. So there's hierarchies in all kinds of different spiritual or religious traditions. It's going to be different in science, right?
Yes, and in science per se, there's hierarchy of hardness of science that's very pervasive, where physics is the hardest science, and then the physicists defer to the mathematicians to some degree, which is a pure intellectual abstraction in some senses. That, and then the chemists defer to the physicists, and the biologists to the chemists, and the psychologists to the biologists, and the sociologists to the psychologists.
Okay, so what I'm going to just like jump in, and I want to bring it back to us a little bit to start with the individual, and I'm curious, like, where do we see hierarchy within ourselves? Where is that showing up? Sophia, do you want to say something?
Well, I also just want to bring up the distinction between valuing something more than something else, and then actually giving that thing power over something else. So it's one thing to value physics over chemistry. It's another thing to make it so that physics decides certain ways that we understand the world and ignores chemistry. In the same way within the body, it's another thing to value the conceptual mind than it is to give the conceptual mind complete power over interpreting reality and not the emotions.
Great distinction.
So I think that power switch is the major distinction he's bringing up.
Right. Yeah, that's very helpful.
And
then, of course, later on when he's talking about use value, that's one of the rabbit holes that I went down that I thought was very interesting, because in economics, things are valued differently. So they have a use value, which is based on how it's utilized and consumed. There's an exchange value, which is more related to a price. And then there's social value, which has to do with other factors. Let me see if I can find this here. He's talking about commodities, let's see. And I don't know if we want to jump there that quickly, but I think that it's very important what you just brought up, Sophia, this distinction that he's making. value and power.
Yeah. Or value in terms of preferencing. But that distinction between use value and exchange value is important in a lot of ways, and kind of brings up his Marxist origins, because that was one of the major things that Marx brought up, is that when we start giving commodities power in themselves, or instead of like we use them, or we relate to them through their use value, so in relation to our own lives and our own ends, but instead we view them as what he calls commodity fetishism, which is like viewing commodities as having exchange, like through their exchange value, and alienated from the labor that's been put into them, and more just as these things that can be exchanged separate from the human energy that's put into them and the human value that's given to them.
Right, precisely. So even I was thinking about some of this in terms of brand, even in how certain brands of things have been fetishized, like, oh my God, I have to have an apple, blah, blah, blah. Or even with food, this is the case. And we see people, Bobby Flay, and, and this is in a sense how we even ended up with our president, because celebrity has been fetishized. So if somebody's famous or if somebody's wealthy, now they're being ascribed a social value that's taking precedent over other kinds of qualities that might meet our real needs better.
Like having an idea of policies.
Well, right, yeah.
And the distinction between fame and infamy is lost in this whole process too.
Lenore, did you have something to say?
I just didn't hear the last, between a distinction between fame and what?
Fame and infamy.
Oh.
It's just how much they appear on our screen. Doesn't matter for what.
Yeah, speaking of screen, can we go back to seeing each other, because that great.
Thank you.
Do you maybe want to give some space for Lenore to talk about her initial reactions to the chapter?
Have you all done that already?
What did you say?
Have you all done that already? Did I
Yeah.
miss that?
Yeah.
I don't think I can make a generalization about it. I'm a little overwhelmed by all of this, I have to say. So I'm going to listen in as much as I can, and if I can join in, I will. I've highlighted things as I read it, try to grasp it, but I must say that I don't know that I've understood enough or followed it enough to be able to talk about it.
Well, what about one of the questions that arose for you that you were, you might have been struggling with in it, that we can maybe all explore together? I mean, I think there's it's a very dense chapter, and it certainly referred to a lot of things I had no familiarity with, and I didn't get through it myself, to be honest with you. I didn't get through the whole chapter because I was really dug into researching some of these economic terms to see if I could understand what he was referring to, as if I knew. So I want to invite you to throw something out there, even if it's a term or if it's anything like, oh, I was reading this sentence and I don't understand it. And then let's take a look at it together, if you like.
Well, let's see. I had made some notes here, questions, as I got towards the end of it. Here's something. Kathy. On page 150, I've underlined, and I'll tell you what my question is. They said at the end of that section on 150, if the growing civil space occupied by the male is still enveloped in a natural matrix of blood ties, family affinities, and work responsibilities based on a sexual division of labor, not until distinctly social interests emerge that clash directly with this natural matrix and turn the weaknesses, perhaps the growing tensions, of organic society into outright fractures. Will the unity between human and human and between humanity and nature finally be broken? Then power will emerge not simply as a social fact with all its differentiations, but as a concept. And so will the concept of freedom. I guess I wrote on top here, I don't get the development here, but that the last part of it was good. I mean, I guess I understood the last few lines, but I don't understand how it got there. That's where I am. Maybe somebody else can.
Yeah, I'd be happy to flesh that out a little bit more with you. So I agree that part that you read in particular was really challenging for me as well. And it wasn't until I went back and reread the couple of paragraphs before that it started to make sense again. And what I found was that, so the general arc of this chapter is the emergence of hierarchy. And so he's talking about the relationship of scarcity to needs and how that separation created a hierarchical relationship. And then he talks in this section specifically about the division of labor between the masculine and the feminine, and how that came out of a biological need for the women to be raising the children and thus be more stationary, and the men having to go off and do these things. But then those traits transformed into something different. You see at the top of 150, which is the distinctly feminine traits, which in primordial society prizes as a high survival asset, sink to the level of social subordination. The woman's nurturing capacities are degraded to renunciation, her tenderness to obedience. Man's masculine traits are also transformed. His courage turns to aggressiveness, his strength is used to dominate, his self-assertiveness is transformed into egotism, his decisiveness into repressive reason. And so it's in this transformation of the traits that's themselves that came from like a biological underpinning that the power relations started to emerge. So originally, when it was just a division of labor and it just was this biological reason everyone agreed with the roles that they had been given, it was more equitable. There's more sense of equality in that way. And it wasn't until those traits went through that transformation and became that the power relations were kind of implicit in them, did the hierarchy start to emerge. And so this is just one phase of his larger argument of how from these tribal organic societies, hierarchies had this natural progression. Does that make more sense? And then following that paragraph, he goes into age and how age was normally very equitable because everyone gets old and then they get those power privileges, and then started to become more I don't know what's the word is, inequitable, I guess, just like the problematic in that way. Does that make more sense, Lenore, or should I flesh it out a little bit more? I'm also having trouble hearing you. If you could go a little bit closer to the microphone, that would help.
Is that better? Here?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I followed that, and I followed the stuff about age. That was interesting. I guess it loses. I get lost when he goes into actually what he's talking about, but he's trying to make a point altogether about hierarchy, but he keeps referring to Marxism and class structure and developments that I'm afraid I'm not interested anymore. I have to be frank. I read about Marxism. I did my thesis on socialized medicine when I was 17 years old, which is a long time ago. And before there was even, when communism was when it existed. And I find that I struggle with his going back into Marxism and class systems and this and that. I guess it's just not where my heart is right now. So that's why I don't. You guys are both so motivated that you're going back and rereading stuff. I try, but then there's a limit. And so I'm not sure whether I can, I love listening to all of you, but I don't know how much more, I can contribute other than occasional questions. So,
yeah, it's also important to remember that he's critiquing Marx. And so it's not that he's going back into Marx, but he's saying that the Marx's central critique around class is not as fundamental as a critique of hierarchy itself, and that hierarchy is throughout our entire individual internal relationship and in every aspect of our relationships with nature and with each other. And so he's trying to get away from an economic critique and move more towards a fundamental critique of how hierarchy emerged within ourselves and within society.
Okay.
I completely agree with what your point, Sophia. That's exactly my understanding of what he's trying to do centrally.
Yeah, this is Mario, and I think he also goes beyond society. He at the end of the chapter, he talks about the relationship between countries themselves, where there is an interesting paragraph from my point of view, when he says, here in the last paragraph, he says, our claims to world cultural hegemony by right of conquest has boomeranged against us. We have been obliged to turn to other cultures, not only for more humane values, more delicate sensibilities, and richer ecological insights. He's talking about the Western so-called civilization, but also for technical alternatives to our highly mystified powers of production, powers that have already begun to overpower us and threaten the integrity of life on the planet. But until recently, our prevailing system of domination not only blinded us to the full history of our own social development, it also prevented a clear understanding of alternative social developments, some vastly better than our own, others as bad, but rarely worse. So he's, in my view, he's taking this hierarchy among civilization to, the hierarchy among different countries, where, our Western center mentality makes a thing that we are if somebody claims to be the pinnacle of the creation, is our Western civilization. And we have dominated and conquered other parts of other cultures and civilizations, and we continue to do that, because to the present day we continue to pretend to be the hegemonic rulers of the planet. So anyway,
I also, Mario, appreciated that point. On the very last page, I underlined the whole last page where he talks about that of the chapter. It was, to me, it seems like a lot of what he's railing against is the idea from European cultures of manifest destiny, that somehow white men are destined to and supposed to take over everyone else's land and culture and teach them how to live. That's the that's in some ways the ultimate in hierarchy. That every aspect of white male life is better than every other type of and form of life on the planet.
And in this country is called American exceptionalism. We are an exceptional, we are above the rest. And we can tell everybody how they have to live, which president they have to allow, whatever. Yeah, this applies, I think this applies to our current situation in the world very, very much.
Current,
very much. I was reminded this week that e pluribus unum, which is on our dollar bills, means unity and diversity, essentially, from the many, the one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that we seem to have forgotten in our society. But it's been there from the beginning as an undercurrent.
Well, it's a scarcity, you know, the concept of a scarcity, I think applies to this domination, because how do we accept, why the people of the United States accepts that the United States has to dominate other countries, have to impose values, have to impose ways of dealing with their economies, what are they going to produce, what they are not, are they going to develop technology, they are not. Why do we all accept that this is a right that we have to impose on the rest of the planet? Well, it's because of fear, of scarcity, the scarcity. If we don't do that, then others are going to take away our precious resources, and others are going to come and take away our cars, our houses, our food. You know, it's the culture of scarcity transformed into fear that allows the dominant culture that we call democracy to impose the values and on the rest of other countries, and there's no diversity. It's just domination, and if a country tries to be independent, well, we have to anyway. But I think scarcity and domination and the acceptance by the people of the United States or the people in Europe that, you know, we are superior and we have to tell other peoples in the world. Well, the Asians now, they think differently and they are emerging as an alternative. We'll see what happens.
I think also the this issue of scarcity, which she addresses in here, is really important because I completely agree with what you were saying, Mario. And like you can see through the issue of immigration and the fear that people have that if we have more immigration, they're going to take all our resources and our wealth. And the wealth in the United States is primarily in the hands of very few people. So that when the average incomes are stated, the statistics are shared, all of those billions of dollars of the Bill Gates and all those people is factored in, and then it's all averaged out among all our population of citizens, and we have the sense that we're a wealthier nation, that people, the citizens in the United States, are wealthier than they are because the statistics are lying the way they're being interpreted and shared in the media and in the news. So we're operating, even the wealthiest are operating in this scarcity model that they have to keep accumulating. And I think one of the things that I kept coming up for me in this chapter was how a scarcity mentality that may have happened in times before, where there was not enough, like people in their place did not have enough food. And so they moved to another place to get food. So it's been happening since the beginning of time. But there may have been some programs around scarcity that continue even when we are not in places and times of scarcity. And we know that on the planet at this time, we have the resources to distribute all the food and no one need to go hungry.
An interesting example of manufactured scarcity in this case, kind of building off what you just said, is the fear that we have around automation and AI technology of taking out all our jobs. But if the wealth of our country were distributed in a way that was more equitable, then increased automation and AI just means that we all need to work less, and that we would be able to spend more time on art and philosophy and these more like greater human potentials. But instead, we're all worried that we're not going to be able to eat once the robots take our jobs. You know, so it's this example of that there's scarcity, there's a feeling of fear and scarcity when there doesn't really need to be one, you know, because overall we're able to produce what we need more easily.
Yeah.
Though, how does, I don't understand, how does AI and technology does take away jobs because people can no longer needed to do those jobs. Now, there are other jobs that they have to be trained for and that possibly they can fill. But at the moment when a person hears AI is going to take jobs away, they know that they're not prepared for it. So there is a reality to that fear.
Right, but that fear isn't a fear of the robots themselves, but a fear of the way that the system is structured in such a way that it values the profit motive of the businesses that own those machines rather than the well-being of the people to distribute our basic needs better.
Well
and so
said.
like if
Well
the
said.
people owned those machines, then we wouldn't need to work as much to be able to get our food and our technology and our needs met. It's
So
that.
an example.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Did you hear what I said? Because I just was responding to that. One thing you said, if the people own the means of production, that was Marx's theory.
Yeah.
It worked though, did it?
Well, no, because the government owned it. The people didn't. It didn't happen the way that it was intended. But if we look at Europe as an example of how wealth is distributed to the people, people work less and have more security and essentially are richer, although maybe less in dollars or pounds or whatever it is, or euros. But they don't have a scarcity of time and leisure. Like they don't have this preponderance of stress that we have in the US of like at any moment my job could be gone. I don't have insurance or health care. If I have a family and I have a catastrophic health scare, then my kids aren't going to have, there's no money for them to go to college. They don't have that because the resources have been distributed in such a way that people have access to health care, that they have paid vacations for a month, a year, and so on and so forth. So I think once again, looking at what we've given power to, like we've given power to the fact that of a Puritan work ethic that says that you have to work at a job like a drudge, as Bookchin would say, like enslaved to a system or immiserated, doing something you don't love even. That's a scarcity mentality, really, that we're all, it's conditioned us to believe that we need to do that. But what if we don't? Where's his postulation about what freedom is maybe that's not the reality. Maybe there's something else and we could be free to do what we love to do and share the wealth on the planet and take care of it together.
I imagine that in countries where there's a guaranteed national income or where it's seriously debated.
Lost the sound.
Yeah, we lost your sound, Ken.
He's muted.
Yeah, there are countries that are considering a national guaranteed income. That's what Ken is saying, and I'm all in favor of robots. I think that robots take over.
I already interviewed Sam, and he's filling out.
Sorry, Mario. I think Ken got on the phone and muted himself. Sorry.
Okay.
Please continue.
So again, my point is, I agree with Sarah, and I'm in favor of robots. I like robots. I think that robots should be doing a lot of the stupid things that we are doing these days, and free ourselves to do creative, have a creative life, and enjoy long vacations, and enjoy life in general. Visit other civilizations, learn from them, but there has to be a change in the system. There has to be a guaranteed income for everybody, and that's what some countries in Europe are debating right now. There are small countries like Denmark, very egalitarian, but there are only 6 million people. They can decide, okay, we can, they pay very high tax rates, but they have healthcare, education, free time, and they don't have to work like slaves like we do here. And if you ask the American people if they want to establish a guaranteed income for everybody, probably they will reject that, because why do I have to be responsible? Why do I have to give this to them, lazy immigrants or whatever?
Well, I mean, that brings up kind of the distinction that Maxime made between the machines or the distribution of wealth being done by the state versus small collectives of people who have trust built among each other and a sense of community and a sense of commitment to each other's well-being. Because when you give all that power back to the state, then that's still just this alienated thing with centralized power that's just as bad as the corporations ruling us. But when it's your own, someone that you've known and built a trustworthy relationship over time with, you're more willing to to feel like your income should be shared with them. I would love to go deeper into this distinction that you made, Maxime, between scarcity of resources and scarcity of time, which is really, and I think Mario was bringing up that as well, being able to live your full life and enjoy yourself and have leisure time, and the ways in which we trade scarcity of resources for scarcity of time and fulfillment and spiritual fulfillment and community and belonging and other forms of scarcity. And I guess other forms of scarcity, but also other forms of wealth. And what that wealth looks like.
And there can be ways, in my own bakery, I apply those principles. Whenever we incorporate a new mixer that saves us 2 hours of time, we don't reduce the payment of 2 hours to the workers. We just say, okay, you work 2 hours less, and that's it.
That's a really perfect example of what happens when the people own the machines,
Exactly. So we want robots, but not to fire people and, somebody appropriating the money to make more money. And no, we just do that. Okay, we save 2 hours because we have a new Chinese mixer that we were able to buy for very little money. And that helps everybody. So we work 2 hours less and everybody makes the same money because we are getting the same amount of money for the bread. So
So you've increasing the quality of life.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And this is something that I feel like it's been forgotten in the
Yeah,
public domain. It's a conversation that's happening in other parts of the world. For instance, I think it's New Zealand Parliament is discussing incorporating to the concept of the gross domestic product or profit, a happiness quotient.
yeah,
Bhutan has a happiness quotient that is
yeah,
like the highest in the world, and people are looking at it because we have a situation in this country. Well, I work in health, in the health field, and the most common thing that I see among everybody who comes in looking for support for their health, they say, but I don't have the time to cook. I don't have the time to eat healthy food. And the first thing we look at always is, what poison are we taking in? And how can we remedy that without having to take medication or get hospitalized or have surgeries? It's the most natural thing in the world. And yet people say they do not have time to feed themselves. We have time to watch entertainments, you know, but we don't have time to feed ourselves as a nation. This is an epidemic, a health epidemic that is caused by an economic system that's kind of out of control. Maybe not kind of, I don't know. That's why this is so pertinent for me, because I've been looking at these issues for so long. And, you know, Marxism, I see Marxism as being part of history. And part of what Bookchin is saying is, let's not forget our history, because we are living out our history. And so if we can bring consciousness to what we're living in the present and what our minds, what the stories are that we're believing and telling ourselves and acting from, then we can change that. If we don't agree, you know, if we know where it led and what it's doing, we don't have to live out of that. We can make a conscious choice, and then we become free. That's what I'm understanding from what he's saying.
Yeah, and then that actually brings a lot of clarity to me about the distinction that he made between freedom of choice and the certain kinds of scarcity that he was talking about, of like the inability to be really free to choose when you are in such a scarcity mindset.
Oh my God, what he was talking about in terms of the way advertising and media, social media and so on has created a kind of a fundamentally impacted the way we think about what our needs are, that have really nothing to do with what our needs are. They've manufactured production, and the economy has manufactured needs for the consumer to keep this engine moving. But it's destroying life. Sorry if I keep going back to that.
But I think because one question always comes to mind: how do we change that? How do we? And I think Sarah's point is very important. Only maybe the whole society is not going to change unless there is a big, tremendous crisis that collapses everything, much bigger than the one in 2008. But if not, the only solution is to create small communities where people trust each other and knows that we are all going to be working for the common good and for enjoyment of life and taking care of each other. It can only happen in small groups that where there is trust, where there is you know, everybody knows, everything is transparent, nobody's taking about. which is also very difficult to do.
It's all difficult. I mean, I think that what you're speaking about, both of you, in terms of working in, you know, small local, let's say, right? Think globally, act locally, is a way to build a foundation, certainly. And I think that we're seeing that smaller nations, cities, states, sovereign regions, what have you, are making progress beyond what a larger organization can do. And at the same time, Paul Spencer said to me, Murray Bookchin's, you know, friend, that if you look at history, these crises have often organically birthed people working together with a higher degree of collaboration, compassion, and so on. So I think there's a combination of things that may be conspiring to change. If we're going to do it, we have to use our conscious intent in whatever way we can locally, perhaps, and then also be willing to adapt fast and work together. I remember, Mom, you talking about after 9/11, how New York changed. And I certainly saw it. You know, when I grew up in the 1970s, New York was really like kind of dangerous, wild place to be. Not just for a kid. I mean, it had that reputation all over the country. And when I go back there, since 9/11, New Yorkers are nicer. They're nicer people. They reach out, they help people, they answer, you know, nobody would go near you if you were in trouble when I was a kid. They'd go the other way. And that crisis made everyone feel vulnerable and helped people to recognize that we're in it together. And of course, it's a diverse city, so there isn't the same kind of, I think, putting certain ethnic groups, you know, like the immigrants are all the problem. I don't think that that's as alive in New York City as it is in other parts of the country, though I could be wrong. I don't know.
No, I think it's one of the sanctuary cities, like San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Responding to something that Mario said and kind of building off of what Maxime said, my personal kind of theory of change is this kind of yes and of creating small local trust networks that can form alternative supply chains and alternative economies and distributed power and decision making, and then also being able to learn how to collaborate again and cooperate again is the way to prepare for those moments of crisis when there are vacuums of power. And so especially when it comes to getting our basic needs met in those moments. And so as we see the rise in ecological disaster, we've already, you know, if we are creating these communities, we've already trained to distribute resources and distribute basic needs within those trust-based communities so that we're more able to be agile and resilient in the face of the breakdown of our systems and not so reliant on these very top-down hierarchical structures like Red Cross, which has been proven to be really, really insufficient in addressing what happened in Puerto Rico and leaving tons and tons of materials just to go to waste at the side of the ocean and the ports. And so like it's kind of like a being ready for crisis, but also establishing these systems and these habits of cooperation beforehand. You know.
Agreed. Something I've often thought about is creating alliances between business owners, such as yourself, Mario, who have this type of thinking and policy in place that is looking at a bigger picture beyond the profit margin, the bottom line, that is looking at quality of life and care of the individuals who are supporting the business and working to produce commodity, if you will, and then promoting these businesses as being allied with certain values for a sustainable, high quality of life for all. And so that's just one way that I've been thinking about how we can do just that, Sophia. And then another thing that comes to mind to what you're talking about is the type of study groups that people are doing where they're working on nonviolent or compassionate communication, using language associated with wants and needs, desires and needs, getting familiar with speaking for oneself and sort of moving out of the hierarchical, manipulative, coercive communication systems that many of us were raised in and conditioned to. And practicing that together. Because under times of stress and duress and chaos, it can be activating. And if we've practiced some of these things, we might be more inclined to support one another rather than to get into our stress response and do fight and flight, or fight or flight.
Which I think is what's so interesting about Bookchin's argument, is that it's not just the class relations that we have to get rid of, or the distribution of wealth. It's the way in which domination plays out in our own minds and our own relationships between sexes and between ages and with nature. And so that when we are creating these like alliances of business owners and having there be like a well-done consumer network to be able to give feedback and having it connect with policy changers and this very like holistic alternative systems or holistic ways to do systems change, we're not just repeating the same patterns of hierarchy in those new systems. And so it's not enough to just look at class. You have to go to something more fundamental, which is domination and hierarchy. And so that's what I value most about this book, is that when you're creating these new systems, to keep these more fundamental things in mind, and by understanding the historical trajectory of how hierarchy emerged in our relationship, we're able to not repeat that history in the creation of new systems.
Precisely. Yeah, I mean, the basis of the United States of America is a great case in point of a persecuted people that left. They flew, they were in flight from persecution in Europe, and they came here and they persecuted the people who were here. They actually had so integrated that hierarchical domination model that they became the dominators, right? And so that is embedded in our history. And until we take responsibility, like accountability personally, right here, not blaming the forefathers or anything like that, but saying, where does this live inside of me so that I don't perpetuate this in my life? And then how can I integrate this in some way in the systems in which I operate and work with others and create products that are of use to other people and services that serve other people and the greater good.
And Ken and Mario, that last page that you both really appreciated, I really loved it. Well, that whole last page on 158, because I feel like he's really getting at this point of that the entire like Eurocentric mindset that's coming at these cultures, that is looking down on their more like primitive way of understanding and looking up at their way that civilization shows itself, is really backwards in a lot of ways, because civilization lives out these really like the damaging dominant relationships. And so that one line before what you read, Mario, the only now, after our own pagan idols such as nucleonics, biological warfare, and mass culture have humiliated us sufficiently, can we begin to see that non-European cultures may have followed complex social paths that were often more elegant and more knowledgeable than our own? It's so beautiful. Yeah, feel free to dig deeper into that last page that you both enjoyed.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on them.
Well, I think he is also when he mentions about European Western civilization, he's talking about Christianity, basically. You know, our Christian, who who was able to the American genocide of the native civilizations. Who were these people capable of these genocides of hundreds of millions of people destroying civilization? They were Christians. Christians were the source. There's no other equivalent genocide in the whole history of the world, of the magnitude of what happened in America and in other parts of the world with the European Christians taking over and feeling that they had the right to massacre and to take over and dominate other cultures. So the roots are in Christianity and are here with us. We are a Christian country, supposedly.
And it just occurs to me that belief that one has a right to do that these people came here with and said, okay, how do I make this place work for me? There, I can plant food, I can, bring animals and develop animals, and I can take over and use the people who are living here, because after all, they're not like me, they're different. How is that different in a sense than primitive man who said that about animals? They're not like me. I can use animals this way. It just crosses my mind, and I can't answer that question. Can you?
I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think the way our relation to animals is an interesting, another example of domination in that way. It's just, but I also eat and use animals, but it is interesting to see the way that comes out as well.
That can serve us, that we can be affectionate with, and they appreciate our affection and can care for them. And the ones that are useless to us, that we use them for our food. And who's to argue with that? This is what we eat, and the fish eat smaller fish, and so it's sort of also logical in a certain way that these people came here and said, oh, well, these people aren't like me, therefore I can use them. I mean, I appreciate very much what Mario was saying, that's...
Well, you have to also think that the pilgrims, when they came to this country, they were very religious people, but they knew nothing about fishing, about growing crops. They were useless. They had no idea. There was abundance next to them, abundance of cod. That was the basic resource for for food in Europe for centuries, but they didn't know how to fish. They didn't know how to grow anything. They didn't know. That's why they had to steal from the natives, because that's the only way they had to survive. But they were surrounded by abundance of fish or many other food sources, but they were ignorant. They were totally ignorant. They didn't know how to go and fish, for example. Anyway.
Yes, I remember from American history in high school being given readings of...
Can't hear you too well.
I was given readings in American history class in high school of some of the early pilgrims who came over that cataloged all the different types of trees, because at the time, 1492-ish, Europe had become cities, and there was no space for anybody. They'd used up so much of their resources. So they got here to this land, and they were like, oh my God, they would write home, you cannot believe how many birds there are here. And we've seen this many birds. These are the ones we know, but these are all the ones we don't know. And then all the trees and all the plants and all the land. And they were like, this is for us to use. And that is underlying the mindset of the early settlers. The native people lived in balance with the animals. And I can tell you from people that I know, my Ecuadorian friends who come from the Amazon, I'm going to tell you a little story from a friend of mine named Chicham Chiriap, who grew up in the Amazon rainforest. And he said that when he was growing up, that jungle was his playground, and they climbed the trees like the monkeys. Well, he came to Sonoma County, and he lived in Sonoma for a number of years. And when he went back, he was so affected by the culture that when he saw the children climb the trees and start to swing on the vines, like we have our image of Tarzan doing, that's what they did. He was like, be careful. But that's not the way the culture is there, because they live in harmony with their environment. And those children speak to even the jaguars. They know how to get along with them. They don't eat the jaguars. That's not a food source for them. So we are very, very far away from that type of connection with the natural world and with animals. But my experience with some indigenous people is that not everybody is like us.
No.
So, you know, I just want to encourage, like, go connect with people who still have indigenous roots to learn how they make it, how they survive. They're fighting what looks like a losing battle. They're losing all of that wildness, and we need it. We need it as well as they need it. Go ahead, Mario.
No, I was thinking that somebody commented, I don't know where, or I read it somewhere, that of all the Europeans that had been captured by the natives during the colonization of the North American, nobody wanted to go back to the European civilization. They all wanted to stay with the natives. They said, "Oh, this is a much better way of life."
Well, they have more space here. Among other things, just space.
Yes. More space and more fun, because, there was no, anyway. I think it's time, isn't it?
Maybe we could just talk real briefly about the chapter for next week.
Yes.
So in my perusing of it, it looks really interesting. I will give a warning that the last 10 pages uses a lot, or makes a lot of references to some philosophy that we may not be familiar with and is not super relevant to us. So there's some pages on Aristotle, and there's some pages on Freudian Marxism. From my looking at it, it looks like the content of what he's trying to say is really interesting. So if you're able to kind of do a good reading of the first 20 pages, and then the next 10 pages real skim anything that's more referencing something else, but try to get the little nuggets of summaries that he's doing, that'd be a really good way to go through it. The first 10-15 pages look really cool. And then if I could maybe give some background on the word epistemology, which hopefully is not too off-putting, because the chapter is called Epistemologies of Rule, which seems off-putting, but epistemology is a word in philosophy that's used for how we come to know something. That's what it means. It's like different ways of knowing, and so there could be different forms of people's theories of how we come to know the world. And I'm assuming that when he says epistemologies of rule, it means how we come to legitimize rule. That idea of what is it that legitimizes knowledge, that makes it not just some subjective thing that we're guessing at, but makes it legitimate in some way, a way for us to be like, that's actually real, to know what is real. And so I think he's talking about what makes it, from this shift from hierarchies to class societies to even more differentiation within society, how is it that we legitimize that rule? So don't be off put, please, by the word epistemology.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
So, but it's about 30 pages, and I think that if we skim a good bit of it and try to just get the nuggets out, we can still have a really great discussion.
So the homework is just chapter 4 or chapter 4 and chapter 5?
I think just chapter 4.
Okay.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Maxime?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
It looks kind of dense, so I wouldn't want to try to do both.
Yeah. Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you next
Bye-bye.
week.
Bye.
Bye.